impact on the FTSE 100. We also assess its outlook over the coming year. This is Bloomberg.
VK ฟิล์มรถยนต์เกรดสูงกันร้อนสูงสุด 76%
At Bloomberg, we believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. It's a community of global leaders and innovators who are blazing new trails to transform business and government. This platform will help them share their ideas with the world and provide access to the resources they need to bring them to life. Bold thinking, breakthrough action. Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
In the past 2 decades, China has built large infrastructure projects in almost every country in Africa.
African governments themselves said we are tired of aid and charity. We want to do trade. We want to be treated like partners. The Chinese came along and said, great, we don't do aid and charity. We want to do business with you.
Global Gateway will mobilize 300 billion euros till 2027.
Now the US and Europe are answering back with their own infrastructure initiatives to counter China, but African experts are skeptical.
China has been that guy around the corner with, a bouquet of flowers to Africa, of the US, Europe and the UK have time and time again said, be careful of the flowers you see out of the window, they have thorns on them.
Markets are preparing to close, but the day is not over yet.
Stock that is now up about 45%.
A lot of volatility right now.
You need the power of the Bloomberg terminal to get you market-moving data before anyone else.
These numbers are much higher than expected.
Upgraded today to overweight.
You need top analysts to bring you exclusive global insight into cross-asset markets.
The muni bond market.
China is a really big focus.
Bitcoin ain't playing along today.
It's going to be short-term.
Bloomberg Markets, The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg.
Welcome back to the Open, everyone. 22 minutes in the European trading day. Pressure across the board. The European stocks at 600, down 0.3%. Again, a lot of these stocks are subdued, falling for 3 straight fears. This is on fears, actually falling for 3 straight days on fears that Jay Powell on Friday in Jackson Hole will be much more hawkish than expected. Tom.
OK, let's get back to the geopolitics and the overlay onto the European stock space. The war in Ukraine and wider European geopolitics this year have had enormous implications, of course, for commodity prices, as we've been discussing through the show, inflation and interest rates, with plenty of uncertainty around. One market, though, that has shown some stability is the FTSE 100. Let's dive deeper into this with Tim Craighead from Bloomberg Intelligence. We'll just refer to you by your surname now.
I like that.
We've elevated you. Just like Craighead.
I want to be called Lacroix.
There we go, Lacroix. From Lacroix to Craighead. Craighead. We were speaking to Citi. Citi yesterday, they said this is one area they still want to get exposure to, is the FTSE 100, UK equities, because of the potential upside there. Just break down what you're seeing.
Yeah, we thought it was timely to go back and look at our fair value scenario. We published a note on it this morning. And as we look at the drivers for both earnings and valuation, we see a pretty stable picture over the course of the next 6-9 months for the FTSE. Fair value is maybe modestly down below where we are right now. Now, there are scenarios, thinking about geopolitics, where if Russia, Ukraine ease, if China resumes growth, given all the stimulus they're now throwing at the economy, we could see 10+% upside on a variety of drivers. If we go into a full-fledged stagflation environment, earnings will suffer. Valuation could break a little bit more, although we think we're close to the bottom on FTSE valuation. and that could give us some pretty significant downside eventually, but clearly it's been more stable.
Tim, although I really want to call you Craighead, I think that's the coolest name. I mean, the concern with the FTSE is that you have these very big companies, right? Energy, some of the miners, but then everything else is very different. So, I mean, they're not created equal.
No, they're not. And I guess this plays into some of the key earnings drivers that I think make the FTSE unique. You do have about 20% of the market that is big energy and metals and mining. And clearly, that's been a good thing for most of the last 6 to 12 months, obviously, especially on the energy front. You've also got a big financials sector, 20% plus of the market. And that's benefiting from higher interest rates playing through to net interest margins. By the same token, you've also got about 40% that's in big global brand franchises, whether it's healthcare, consumer, and that's winning because of the weak pound. And so you've got a big chunk that might be a barbell type structure, and this has been sort of the perfect unfortunate storm to make these things work relative to the rest of Europe.
How much of a catalyst could PE, private equity, play in terms of acquisitions across the space?
I'll be skeptical on that front. There's a lot of folks who will say the FTSE's cheap at 9 and change times earnings, it's for sale. But it's cheap for a reason. Going back to that composition thing, if you think about all that's in metals and energy and financials, those are cheap sectors almost by definition, especially when you've got peak earnings. And the stuff that has big multiples, tech, internet, there's none in the FTSE. I mean, there's 1% in the FTSE that's technology. So our take on this is cheap for a reason.
Tim, thank you so much, as always, for the insight. Tim Craighead there from Bloomberg Intelligence with some pretty great analysis. Now, coming up, Argonaut Capital Partners founder and chief executive officer Barry Norris on the troubles hitting Cineworld. That's coming up next. I'm looking at telecoms and mining stocks amongst the biggest declines in today's trading session. Again, Tom was talking about the fact that Richemont, the luxury conglomerate, actually sold a stake in Yux Net-a-Porter to Farfetch. So that's dragging.
VK ฟิล์มรถยนต์กันร้อนดีราคาถูกรถยนต์เริ่มต้น 3,000 บาท
At Bloomberg, we believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. It's a community of global leaders and innovators who are blazing new trails to transform business and government. This platform will help them share their ideas with the world and provide access to the resources they need to bring them to life. Bold thinking, breakthrough action, Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
What about cryptocurrencies? Are you a believer in cryptocurrencies?
No, I'm not a believer in cryptocurrencies. And I would say that cryptocurrencies are a bubble. And I would describe cryptocurrencies as a limited supply of nothing. So to the extent there's more demand than the limited supply, the price would go up. But to the extent the demand falls, then the price would go down. There's no intrinsic value to any of the cryptocurrencies, except that there's a limited amount.
Well, based on what you've just said, why would you not put a big short of some type on cryptocurrencies? Or maybe you have, but do you think that's a good short?
Well, you know, when we look for these subprime, the reason why we shorted these subprime in size because it was asymmetrical. You're shorting a bond at par that has a limited duration that trades at a 1% spread of treasury. So you can't lose more than the spread in the duration. Yet if it defaults, you can make the par amount. In crypto, there's unlimited downside. So even though I could be right over the long term, in the short term, as the case of Bitcoin, you know, went from 5,000 to 45,000, you know, I would be wiped out on the short side. So it's just too volatile to short.
everything you need to get set for the start of U.S. trading. Bloomberg The Open with Jonathan Farrell. Drilling down on the numbers and preparing you as only Bloomberg can. Weekdays on Bloomberg.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Welcome back to The Open, everyone. 30 minutes into the European trading day, and here are your top stories. Taking back control, Neil Kashkari says the Fed needs tighter monetary policy to keep inflation in check. Cautious mood will stocks fluctuate as investors look ahead to Jackson Hole. And 6 months on, Ukraine marks a tense Independence Day as it hits the half-year milestone since Russia's invasion. So, Tom, if you look at the markets, I mean, they're really just waiting for Jackson Hole.
Yeah, we had those
comments.
Looking
at something else?
Well, I think you're 100% right? And you had Neil Kashkari coming out, of course, the Uber dove to the Uber hawk, just reiterating in that speech yesterday that for him, it's got to be that inflation focus. That is the priority. So getting back down to that 2% target. What that means, of course, in terms of where the rate hike lands in September remains an open debate. We have more data coming through in terms of course, inflation expectations and the CPI print out before that decision. But all of that is weighing up with that data as well that we got out of the US yesterday. Mark Cudmore breaking that down for us in terms of the weakness when it comes to home sales and services, manufacturing as well, all looking softer, pointing to that slowdown in the US economy. The benchmark here in Europe currently down 0.5%, lower in Germany by 0.7%, and the FTSE 100 down 44 points, 7,443. Let's switch it on and look at the sectors then. Just a couple that were in the green. Now just one sector in terms of what we're seeing across the space here in 30 minutes into the trading session. Utilities is essentially range-bound, as is food and beverage. At the bottom of the list, you've got basic resources down 1%, auto parts and retail. By the way, when it comes to basic resources, we continue to look at what's happening in China, and a story that unfolded this morning was that scrutiny in terms of real estate executives over in China. Just a reminder that the tightening around the real estate sector, even as they try and support parts of that economy and housing, continues in terms of the focus of officials over in China, and that certainly sent Chinese shares lower. But that is the shape of play across your sectors this morning, this Wednesday, 30 minutes into the trading session. Fran.
Tom, shares in London-based cinema chain Cineworld are dropping again today after an 80% plunge last week. Now, the firm said it was considering a voluntary Chapter 11 filing in the U.S. as it seeks to cut $5 billion debt pile. Now, our next guest has been short Cineworld for over 4 years and says observing the demise of Cineworld has been like watching a tiresome disaster movie populated by B-list actors. Welcome to my life. Barry Norris joins us now. He's founder of Argonaut Capital Partners. Barry, I've seen way too many bad films. If you look at what we could have foreseen with Cineworld, what could they have done differently?
Well, unfortunately, I think the ending in our tiresome disaster movie was entirely predictable. And that is that the management team at Cineworld used too much financial debt to acquire an empire in a sunset industry. And if you think even before COVID, this was a company that had $3.5 billion of financial debt and approximately another $4 billion of financial leases. It's now got $5 billion of financial debt, and it probably owes Cineplex another billion. So a company which pre-COVID was doing $1.5 billion of EBITDA, probably nowadays they'll struggle to do $1 billion of EBITDA. The capital structure of this company is completely unsustainable, and that's why it's going bust.
Barry, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but we look back a couple of years, financing was cheap. There was a rationale, wasn't there, for this company to borrow and to expand. The cinema remains attractive. Are you underestimating and not giving them enough credit for having to face up to that pandemic impact?
Well, I mean, I think during the pandemic, let's be clear, Cineworld took furlough money for pretty much all of its UK employees. It deferred its rents, and at the same time, its management paid itself millions of dollars still. This is not a company you should feel sorry for in any way. The problem is that the cinema industry was always in structural decline through streaming services on TV, through the end of the exclusivity window. and frankly, through the poor quality of Hollywood films that are produced, which can't hold a candle to those produced by previous generations.
But Barry, there was a talk about, some of the gaming worlds being live streamed and that bringing in big bucks. It was also streaming of theaters live that would have brought a new kind of consumer and a new kind of audience to the cinema. What are the lessons learned from Cineworld that you could transpose into the industry or other industries for that matter?
Well, the cinema industry is clearly a low return, pretty poor industry in structural decline. That means that it's not prudent to use so much debt to finance the business. So there's a reason why Cineworld's gone bust and other cinema chains haven't. And they're all pretty average businesses. Cineworld just used far too much leverage and was far too aggressive in its acquisition strategy.
Barry, how much of its debt do you think will ultimately be recoverable, and what do you expect to happen to equity holders in this business?
Equity holders will get zero. Convert holders will also have nothing. There's about $4 billion of secured debt, $1 billion of super preferred debt. I suspect that all of the collateral is in the super preferred debt, so they'll be made whole. And the $4 billion of secured debt holders will be converted to equity. There'll be a debate about what the enterprise value of this company should be. Those further up the capital structure will argue for a lower enterprise value. Those further down, obviously because they want to be included in the value, will argue for a bigger enterprise value. But let's say they come up with a figure of $3 billion. I would suspect that secured debt holders get converted to equity with a 50% haircut.
Barry, so it's very clear that actually, COVID played a huge part in this. I know they were over-leveraged. I know they probably expanded too much. But could they have survived this had we not had COVID?
Well, I think had we not have COVID, it would have survived for longer, but the business strategy wasn't a very good business strategy for all of the reasons we've previously talked about. So, if you like, COVID brought this to a head. But let's be clear about this. Last spring, the share price of Cineworld was £1.30. It had a market cap of $1.5 billion. That was post-COVID. The management could have decided at any time to raise equity to repair the balance sheet, and they didn't. And you'll have to ask them why they didn't do that.
Yeah.
I suspect it's because they didn't want their own equity to be diluted, and they thought that they could manage the company on a wing and a prayer.
Barry, you touched on this, the streaming services, the competition provided there. Of course, streaming companies, the likes of Netflix and others, have faced their own challenges and are having to wrestle with those now. How are you thinking about that space going forward?
Well, I think it rather typifies some of the issues in the tech sector, and that you've had a decade where investors have just fallen over themselves to allocate nearly all of their capital to tech. And as a result, even though there's demand for the products, it's highly competitive and returns are coming down. And frankly, that's why also inflation is so high in the real economy, because all of that money went to tech and none of it went to the old economy. So this dichotomy in markets, I think, is why you have high inflation in the real economy, the best opportunities in areas like energy and fossil fuels. And actually, I think you've got a structural bear market in tech, and you've got structurally high inflation and therefore lower valuations in the equity market.
Barry, what's the worst film you've ever seen? I mean, I was trying, as we were talking about B-list movies, I was kind of thinking, is it something like Sharknado? I think they've done 6, or Snakes on a Plane.
Cats. I think Cats was the biggest box office bomb I've seen recently. And I think, the thing about Cineworld is, it will survive as a company. It's just gone into Chapter 11. The company will go on operating as previous, but the capital structure will just change. The equity holders and some of the debt holders will get wiped out, but it will re-emerge. Now, the question is it going to re-emerge under the same family management team or a different management team. And frankly, I wouldn't be given the producer of Cats the opportunity to make a sequel.
I think that's the key headline from this, isn't it? This interview with Barry Norris. Cats,
know,
the worst movie he's ever seen. Joining a long list of critics of that film, by the way. Barry Norris, founder of Argonaut Capital Partners, not contrarian when it comes to his hatred of Cats, the movie. Thank you for joining us. Coming up, counting the costs of war. As Ukrainians celebrate their Independence Day, the heavy toll of Russia's invasion shows no sign of easing. We examine the economic and political fallout. That is next. This is Bloomberg.
This week, as the world watches inflation rise, employment rebound, and fiscal policies react, all roads lead to Jackson Hole for the Kansas City Fed's 2022 Economic Policy Symposium. Bloomberg's all-star team is live as policymakers and financial insiders discuss the economic issues and solutions that keep the world's money moving. Coverage starts August 25th on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
ไม้สังเคราะห์ SCG ล็อกสีสวยทนจากทุกสภาพแวดล้อมที่มีเทคโนโลยี Color Lock Plus
เซรั่มช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำ 57% ใน 4 สัปดาห์จริงหรือ L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
ผลลัพธ์เหลือเชื่อมากไม่คิดว่าจุดด่างดำบนใบหน้าจะจางลงได้ค่ะประทับใจตั้งแต่ครั้งแรกที่ใช้เลยค่ะ
ทดสอบทางคลินิกแล้วช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำได้ถึง 57%
โดยผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านผิวหนังเลือกใช้
L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
At Bloomberg, we believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. It's a community of global leaders and innovators who are blazing new trails to transform business and government. This platform will help them share their ideas with the world and provide access to the resources they need to bring them to life. Bold thinking, breakthrough action. Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
Mysteries surrounding its necessity and utility have only just been recently uncovered.
Some of our biggest discoveries were in the 1970s or 1980s, and so it makes it a really exciting field because it seems as though we're uncovering new insights each and every day.
Some scientists are going further to find out how sleep and what happens there can be harnessed to further expand our understanding.
It's easy to memorize things. That makes you smart if you can spit back a lot of facts. But if you want to be wise, if you really want wisdom, you got to know when and how and why to use that information. And that's what your brain figures out while you're sleeping.
Welcome back to the Open, everyone. 43 minutes into the European trading day. A bit of pressure across the board. U.S. futures also down. Again, bonds declining also as investors digesting the latest hawkish messages we had from Fed speakers. And then, of course, there are mounting signs that the global economy is slowing. We look at Jackson Hole with that Jay Powell speech on Friday. Now, the U.S. will also announce another $3 billion in arms for Ukraine later today. This is as the country marks a tense Independence Day, 6 months since Russia's invasion. Now, with many world leaders pledging continued support for Ukraine's fight.
We are united in supporting Ukraine, also because defending Ukraine means defending the rules-based international order that our two countries rely on.
I would like to call upon Russia to cease the military actions and to withdraw its forces from the territory of Ukraine.
Okay, the German and French leaders speaking there on their support for Ukraine. We are joined now by Ina Sobson, Ukrainian MP and professor at the Kyiv School of Economics, and Bloomberg senior reporter for international affairs, Mark Champion. Mark, let's start with you. 6 months in then, we've had warnings about potential strikes, this from US intelligence, on this day in Ukraine and the risks around that. Where do things stand?
Well, I mean, there have been strikes every day for 6 months, and it's quite likely that they will be intensified today. But, you know, 6 months, you know, wars are always horrific. They also can be clarifying. I think Ukraine, we've learned a lot about Ukraine. Ukraine has learned a lot about itself. It's a much more united country than it was. Interestingly, you know, for Independence Day today, you had President Zelensky say it's no longer about peace, getting a peace, it's about victory, and there's a strong sense in Ukraine that, you know, that's a possibility. So, you know, the idea of, you know, peace talks at the moment, neither side's really interested. You know, both have goals that they want to achieve. This is going to go on for some time, but on the battlefield itself, this is, you know, the Russians are actually digging in. So it's going to be quite difficult for the Ukrainians to push them back, just as it has been very difficult for the Russians to make progress themselves. Yeah, we're in for this for quite some time, unfortunately.
Ina Sobson, thank you so much for joining us. We know that the U.S. will announce some $3 billion in new arms today to mark also, of course, the independence of Ukraine. What's it like on the ground? Do you feel forgotten? The media are still reporting on it, but less than 2 months ago.
Well, not really, I think, because what is most important is, of course, the weapons deliveries, and that is what we expect from the West. So all the new announcements from the US side, from the Germans and all other countries are actually critically important. But the issue is not only about the money that is being allocated to buy weapons for Ukraine, but also with the specific types of weapons that would be provided to the Ukrainians. And unfortunately, we're still waiting for a single Western country to announce that they are willing to provide tanks for the Ukrainians, because as you rightly put it out, the Russians are digging in, and I don't know a single military strategy of how to kick them out of our territory without the tanks. Yet unfortunately, as of right now, not a single country has actually announced that they are willing to provide tanks to the Ukrainian army. So the question is not only about the number, the amount of money that is being allocated, but also with the types of weapons that would actually be provided to the Ukrainian army. But altogether, I'll tell you this, we do not feel abandoned. We want, of course, more people to be talking about this. But again, the question is not how much we talk about this, but how much arms is provided to the Ukrainian army.
Okay, so that's on the need, Ina, for that continued military support. When it comes to your expertise around economics, what are the key challenges for the Ukrainian economy and the need for international support on that front?
Yeah, indeed, the economic situation is devastating. And I think that is one of the biggest concerns for the Ukrainians right now, because military-wise, not many things are happening right now, apart from the blowing up of the Russian depots with the weapons and ammunition. But with economics, people are now starting to feel that they are getting poorer. The inflation of over 25%, that is something that we are feeling in everyday life. I'm seeing people of middle class like myself who are now starting to think what to buy in the supermarket. That's something that we haven't experienced for quite some time. And of course, the level of unemployment is growing, and that is another concern. But I think that the major issue is you know, we are requiring microfinancial help to sustain the basic functioning of the society, paying teachers to the salary, paying salaries to the teachers, to the doctors, to our military men and women. Those are the issues that Ukrainian budget cannot cover ourselves without microfinancial help from the West. So those are the issues that we need most help with. And we are getting some of the help. However, the amount of money that is being promised and that is actually being delivered is actually very significantly different. So we really hope that the Western countries will actually act upon all the promises that have already been pronounced.
Ina Sobson, does Ukraine worry about stepped-up attacks actually around National Day?
Well, I'll tell you this, that the people have left big cities where that was possible if they were not obliged to go to work on that day. I could definitely see many people leaving. I personally left Kyiv for a personal reason because I'm going to my brother's wedding. But I was seeing that many people were deciding whether to leave or stay. But I wouldn't say that people are terrified. I think people are just rationally cautious about the potential for attack because the panic that we have seen in March, that's gone now. I think now everybody is much more reasonable in understanding the level of threat and in understanding what needs to be done. So I wouldn't say people are panicking, but I would say people are being rather cautious, and we understand that things might actually happen today or tomorrow. That is something we have heard from our intelligence, but then also from the US and other intelligences were saying this.
Mark, let's bring you back in at this point. One thing that your piece really makes stark is just how wrong the analysts got this, whether it's the impact on the Russian economy or, of course, the ability for the Ukrainian military to repel that invasion. Given what we know now, how do you see things? What are the experts now saying about how this eventually plays out, and how much should we read into that analysis, given how badly we all got it wrong leading into this?
Well, I think the analysts are much more cautious now. Right. But you know, essentially, as I was saying, you know, what they do say is that we've got a de facto stalemate on the ground. You know, neither side is moving very fast at all, and the Russians are actually digging in the south. So the general consensus is, you know, this is going to be going on for a while, and possibly the best way to think about the campaign right now is that, you know, the Ukrainians, for their part, are doing the best that they can to destroy supplies and logistics behind the lines for the Russians. The Russians are doing the same, but supplies and logistics on the Ukrainian side are really, it's about damaging the European economy through gas sales and so on, and hoping that that support that we were just talking about will dry up. The weapons, the finance, and that Ukraine will be forced to sue for peace. So it's a kind of behind-the-lines campaign on both sides.
Mark, thank you so much for the update, and thank you so much as well to Ina Sovsun, their Ukrainian MP and professor at the Kyiv School of Economics. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, on Ukraine throughout the day. Also coming up, a whistleblower accuses Twitter of covering up security flaws and fake accounts. Could this help Elon Musk in his legal battle with the social media giant? That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg.
เซรั่มช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำ 57% ใน 4 สัปดาห์จริงหรือ L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
ผลลัพธ์เหลือเชื่อมาก ไม่คิดว่าจุดด่างดำบนใบหน้าจะจางลงได้ค่ะ
ประทับใจตั้งแต่ครั้งแรกที่ใช้เลยค่ะ
ทดสอบทางคลินิกแล้วช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำได้ถึง 57%
โดยผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านผิวหนังเลือกใช้
L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
We believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. This platform will help them share their ideas to reshape our world. Bold thinking, breakthrough action. Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
Knife making is almost meditative for me. There's a lot of passion behind it. There's a lot of hard work behind it. And it's not just something that you kind of just brush off like, oh, this is just a knife. People's hands touch this knife. People pour their passion and their soul inside of these products.
The art of blacksmithing has a very long history. Our notion of what it means to be civilized is to have metallurgy, to have the ability to transform the natural world.
When somebody uses my knife, I want them to say, damn! Golly, this is a badass knife. Come here, let me show y'all something.
Foundation.
to stay. We will never.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Welcome back to the Open. 54 minutes into the European trading day. Losses of 0.5% across the European benchmark. Every single sector in the red now. Future stateside pointing to losses on the S&P E-minis of 0.3%. Let's get back to what's happening with Twitter and Elon Musk. Elon Musk has received now a potential boost in his legal battle with Twitter. Quite the twist. A whistleblower has accused the social media company of, quote, egregious deficiencies in its handling of spam bots and user information. Joining us now is Alex Webb from Bloomberg Quick Take. Of course, all things Twitter and Elon Musk, finger on the pulse firmly when it comes to this story. What do we know about the accusations then from this whistleblower, and to what extent could it help Musk in his legal case?
So inevitably it's complex, but there are two pieces to this. On the one hand, this is mostly focusing on the safety at Twitter, and he's levied some pretty serious allegations, such as a lot of people at Twitter have access to user accounts and can tweet things and get insight and look at people's messages and stuff, and that they are aware that perhaps there are some malicious state actors who are employed by Twitter. They're essentially spies working within Twitter. That's amongst the things he alleges. As far as it directly pertains to Elon, the comments that he's made don't necessarily help him, because he said that actually the monetizable daily active users, that's the number that Elon's picking on, and Twitter says that about 5% of those are bots. The Twitter executives are incentivized to ensure that they are not bots, because monetizable daily active users are things, by definition, you can monetize by getting people to click through, and therefore you can show advertisers that you're generating value. If there are more bots in there than you think, then you get less value for your advertisers.
I like that, more bots in there.
But the crucial thing that Elon is picking on is he's picking on that as a material adverse effect, i.e. suggesting that Twitter has lied about that number, and therefore it gives him reason to pull out the deal. On that count, he doesn't help them. But if there is a material adverse effect because they've lied about something else or misstated something else pertaining to the user safety, then perhaps Elon could pivot.
Alex, thank you. Alex Webb there from Bloomberg Quick Take. Now, that's it for the European Market Open. Surveillance Early Edition is up next. The market's firmly positioned in a kind of wait-and-see situation for Jackson Hole. It's Jay Powell on Friday. All eyes on that. Treasuries, actually, that yield holding above 3%. This is Bloomberg.
VK ฟิล์มรถยนต์เกรดสูงกันร้อนสูงสุด 76%
เซรั่มช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำ 57% ใน 4 สัปดาห์จริงหรือ L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
ผลลัพธ์เหลือเชื่อมากไม่คิดว่าจุดด่างดำบนใบหน้าจะจางลงได้ค่ะ
ประทับใจตั้งแต่ครั้งแรกที่ใช้เลยค่ะ
ทดสอบทางคลินิกแล้วช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำได้ถึง 57%
โดยผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านผิวหนังเลือกใช้
L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
We believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. This platform will help them share their ideas to reshape our world. Bold thinking, breakthrough action. Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
There's a sense it'll get to 7% in the coming months. Do you see that coming true?
There was something of a grey zone battle between Taiwan and China.
Where are the job cuts to come from?
We will not just cut and run.
With unmatched reach and resources from more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, your global business authority. Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question. Great question.
Best question I get all night.
Bloomberg, top experts, great questions.
In Europe, you've got the gas issue. There's nothing quite to the same degree that we have in the US, but it's going to be a slow growth environment, below trend. The Fed wants below trend.
With inflation this high, for me, I'm in the mode of we need to err on making sure we're getting inflation down.
Like in a Greek tragedy, there's just not that much that they can do. There's destiny that's approaching. The economy is weak. When we talk about supply chain disruptions, we're not getting our exercise bikes. When they talk about it, they're not able to heat their homes. That's really weighing on sentiment in the euro, and the ECB doesn't have a tool to address it.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Here's what's coming up on today's program. Taking back control, Neel Kashkari says the Fed needs tighter monetary policy to keep inflation in check. Cautious mood, stocks fluctuate as investors look ahead to Jackson Hole, and 6 months on, Ukraine marks a tense Independence Day as it hits the half-year milestone since Russia's invasion. Now, this is what the markets are telling us. Of course, to focus firmly on Jackson Hole and that Jay Powell speech on Friday. European stocks down 0.5%. If you look at S&P futures, also down 0.2%. Euro dollar 1.9954. We have some great feature pieces on the Bloomberg terminal and on the website, looking at what this means for some of the import-export companies, and then that U.S. 10-year yield above 3%. I would suggest a lot of the volatility, of course, will continue to play out in currencies. Talking about currencies, it's different if you're a German exporter or if you're a French exporter. So let's get straight to the European picture and the European map to see exactly the difference. You can see the FTSE down 0.9%. I was looking at the industry groups actually earlier on, a little bit of upside, but really a tiny bit. I think 0.5% higher for some of the consumer stocks. Everything else feeling pressure. The CAC down 0.4%. Now, the Minneapolis Fed President Neel Kashkari says action from the central bank is still very much needed in the fight against inflation. Well, he spoke at a gathering at the Wharton Club of Minnesota.
When inflation is 8% or 9%, we run the risk of unanchoring inflation expectations and leading to very bad outcomes that would cause us to have to be very aggressive, Volcker-esque, to then re-anchor them. We definitely want to avoid allowing that situation to develop. So with inflation this high, I'm in the mode of we need to err on making sure we're getting inflation down.
Now we're joined by Vivek Paul, Senior Portfolio Strategist at BlackRock Investment Institute, and Christina Kino. She's back from New York, from our markets team. Welcome back, Christine. So good to have you on TV. Vivek, let's start with you. When you look at some of the market falls, or certainly the little market correction, how much more do we need to correct to be at a comfortable place to deal with energy prices?
Well, I think, if you look at the events over this summer where we've seen what we think is ultimately a bear market rally, our view has been that some of the market reaction has been effectively a little bit more on the hope of some sort of Goldilocks scenario out, playing out. That's not our base case, and we think that we're still in an environment where we'd be cautious for the next 6 to 12 months on a tactical horizon basis across a swathe of DM equity.
Okay, this is a concern, right, that we haven't really seen the worst for equities. Jackson Hole, I know, is the big focus this week. What's the next catalyst?
Well, Francine, I think it really is going to be what Jay Powell says at that speech. And I think, if we're to believe Neel Kashkari in saying that the Fed is going to have to do more, then I think that's what people people are going to be expecting that other shoe to drop. And as Vivek mentioned, this is still a bear market rally. That's very much the consensus that's out there. And it really just seems like there's this feeling of biding a little bit of time, maybe taking some profit before that next leg lower in equities.
Vivek, is there anything you want to be invested in with conviction? The key word being conviction, not just invest.
Look, honestly, it's tough in the near term, but I think it is important to have like a differentiated view between like the very near term sort of the next few months and the slightly longer term picture. By no means am I saying that you get past the next few months and then it's all rosy again, but I think it's worth saying that when you have a sort of strategic horizon type sort of tilt to your portfolio, we would still be long equity. I think the point being that the next 6 to 12 months is tough to make a strong case.
With quite a lot of volatility in currencies, in equities too.
And I think quite a lot of volatility more generally, because in the environment that we think we're in, we think we've entered a new regime here. This is an environment of higher macro market vol for the foreseeable.
What's your take on what we're seeing in currencies? I mean, we saw parity, and it's amazing to me that actually we saw parity euro-dollar, but the market didn't freak out as much as we thought they would.
Yeah, well, this is the second go at it now, Francine, right? But it's really, really interesting because, the dollar has really had such an incredible run in the first half of this year. And, there's this feeling that, perhaps the Fed has started to do enough to start seeing that inflation finally come down. And perhaps this is the opening for other currencies to kind of regain some of that lost ground. But I think, investors are taking a look at the comparison between the Fed, for instance, versus the BOE and the ECB. Yeah. The Fed is still very much ahead of these two central banks, and therefore the dollar really still powering higher against both the euro and the pound. So it really does depend now, I think, on that comparative action and whether the BOE and ECB can gain ground in the Fed here.
Yeah, Vivek, and we have this great dollar chart looking at the dollar rally actually pausing somewhat. I mean, this kind of changes everything, but I wonder how long it will take for us to work out through the second round effects of what we're seeing in energy prices. Already we're seeing in the U.S. 1 in 6 households struggling to repay those bills.
Yeah, and I think the trouble is, again, to my point earlier, I think we've yet to see the worst. And I think for our view here, I think the point would be that the markets have been reacting as if the Fed is on the verge of pivoting. We think ultimately they will pivot, but we don't think we've seen the signs yet to suggest that's coming right now.
My concern, I understand that the central bank, in general, actually, central banks are in a really tough place, but it does seem like, they're reacting to data point, which means that they don't really have control of the narrative. Is this us really coming to the limit of what central banks can do when it's a supply shock inflation?
Well, completely. And to the point I made earlier, this is exactly the reason why we believe we're in this slightly different market regime. We've been calling for this higher era of macro market volatility. It's because, to your point, supply is dominating and leading the fact that inflation is being created. We're in a situation where, of course, inflation is always about demand and excess of supply, but it's supply, it's the production capacity that's unusually low at the moment. Central banks only have a blunt tool to deal with that.
Did you miss us when you were in New York? Because the European markets are that much more exciting. For 10 years, they've underperformed. When are we ever going to overperform, here in Europe?
Oh, Francine, not now. Not right now. Definitely not right now. I mean, this is the age-old question, isn't it? It's really, really interesting. I mean, Europe, this was meant to be the year for Europe, wasn't it, right? This is the year of value, a little bit of a backup from that growth play that we've seen, which, of course, the U.S. is very heavy on. But, it just really feels like, just from the perspective being on the other side of the pond, that Europe was really in a tough place, is still really in a tough place on several fronts, not to mention what we're seeing in the markets. We also have this energy crisis that we're all seemingly bracing for this coming winter. And then, of course, you're hearing really just kind of negative headlines regarding economic data, both out of Europe and, again, the UK. So it really seemed like, while I was over there, so like, man, Europe is having such a tough time right now.
I mean, I'm getting popcorn for that Jay Powell speech on Friday because it kind of all rides on him. So we'll see how he puts the nuances. Thank you so much, as always, for some great analysis. Vivek Paul there, Senior Portfolio Strategist at BlackRock Investment Institute, stays with us, as well as Christine Aquino. Now, coming up, Musk gets a potential boost in his battle with Twitter as a whistleblower comes forward. So we have more on that ahead. This is Bloomberg.
ไม้สังเคราะห์ SCG ล็อกสีสวยทนจากทุกสภาพแวดล้อมที่มีเทคโนโลยี Color Lock Plus
เซรั่มช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำ 57% ใน 4 สัปดาห์จริงหรือ L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
ผลลัพธ์เหลือเชื่อมากไม่คิดว่าจุดด่างดำบนใบหน้าจะจางลงได้ค่ะ ประทับใจตั้งแต่ครั้งแรกที่ใช้เลยค่ะ
ทดสอบทางคลินิกแล้วช่วยลดเลือนจุดด่างดำได้ถึง 57%
โดยผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านผิวหนังเลือกใช้
L'Oreal Paris Glycolic Bright Serum
At Bloomberg, we believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. It's a community of global leaders and innovators who are blazing new trails to transform business and government. This platform will help them share their ideas with the world and provide access to the resources they need to bring them to life. Bold thinking, breakthrough action. Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
And apply that to someone's scalp.
We are the only culture that has hair that grows out of our head the way that it does. Anyone from the African diaspora is born with this amazingly curly hair that can be shaped into a variety of different ways of expression.
I want Black people to love themselves for how they naturally appear and also to appreciate the cultural practices such as braiding that our ancestors have practiced for centuries.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
I think Jay Powell said things that were indefensible.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
We think that's the next secular shift.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
Yes, it's about renewables.
It's a challenging dynamic.
This is a level of uncertainty that we haven't had to deal with.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Canada is planning to start shipping green hydrogen to Germany. The Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Chancellor Olaf Scholz signed a 5-year agreement for the fuel to be produced by wind power in Canada's eastern provinces. Now, the aim is to create a transatlantic supply chain for hydrogen with the first deliveries by 2025. Now, of course, this all comes as Europe deals with an energy crunch. We're back with Vivek Paul, Senior Portfolio Strategist at BlackRock Investment Institute, and still with us, Christina Kina as well. So Vivek, we were talking a little bit before, of course, about the fact that the market hasn't really priced in the worst case scenario when it comes to energy prices. Do you worry about zombie companies or small businesses going under, or do you worry about consumer spending and households more?
I think we've got to worry a little bit about both, and I think picking up on that second point, while you take the case of the UK, we have seen some material kind of write-downs in terms of earnings expectations, particularly for those kind of consumer-facing sectors. But arguably, the worry is that has not gone far enough. And you look more broadly, not just across the UK, you're looking at earnings projections across the board. In general, it's not obvious that they're really placed for the downside that could indeed occur, and maybe that's part of the reason why we need to be a bit cautious at this moment in time.
Yeah. So, what does this caution look like actually as we get into the winter months? Again, there's a bit of holiday mood, I guess, overhang. Do we worry about credit card bills?
Absolutely, Francine. I mean, really anything that kind of indicates more weakness in the consumer. Again, I think we're already starting to hear, for instance, of households kind of starting to default on some of their energy bills or thinking about, the tough choices that they're going to have to make. And I think this is very much what central bankers are trying to keep an eye on, especially as we head into the winter months. This is probably the reason, for instance, that we got that massive pivot from the Bank of England a couple of weeks ago and indicating that they're going to be doing a lot more. But the question is it going to be too little too late? Right. Markets are certainly expecting them to deliver and over-deliver in that promise, but the question is, will they?
Right, and I guess it all falls on fiscal policy, right? Can Vivek, the EU, or I would say in the UK, avoid recession or go through a shallow recession if we have enough support from the government?
I think recession, I mean, this isn't going to be like headline news here, right? I think recession is pretty likely. I think in both in Europe and the UK, we're probably already there when we look back on retrospective data and some aspects. But I think the question as to how bad it gets, I think that will be really important in terms of thinking about how the energy sort of shock plays out in different ways in different of those markets. I mean, I think you're looking at the UK, you're seeing not just, I guess, the impacts of the energy shock, but also you look more broadly. We've been in a situation where there are just fewer people effectively in that labour market, that the supply has been challenged, and that is, I think, contributing to the UK weakness in this moment.
And there's not, and I keep on asking this, I know this is a supply shock coming from energy, which really permeates to everything, but this is not also an overhang of COVID, or is it?
Well, no, I was going to say that. So I wouldn't put this all down to energy. I mean, you know, obviously.
What percent is energy?
I think it's very hard to kind of disaggregate. But the thing I would say, look, obviously, it's 6 months to the day of the invasion of the Ukraine, and I think the point would be that, you know, it's tempting to just look at that and say that was the starting point of all what we're seeing now. I think it's bigger than that, and I think the point I was making before about this new regime where we're kind of in this environment where supply shock's dominating, that was already the case. So what you had then, I think, was the energy stuff kind of layering on top of an existing environment where supply shock's dominating. So I think both are at play, and I think, you know, it's tempting to see that it all started with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I don't think it did. I think it goes back beyond that.
Okay, so years of what, underinvestment?
No, I think it's more this idea that, you know, we're now in an environment where you talked about the overhang of COVID. I don't know if it's just about COVID, but COVID was an example of this, where effectively supply is a thing that's dominating, right? So I think at that point we're in that regime now.
I have a million questions on China. I mean, actually, I have a million questions in general, but how do we read China right now?
I mean, I think the news that has been coming through is still very much being interpreted negatively by markets, Francine. But I do think, I was a little surprised, for instance, when we got the news of that surprise rate cut from the People's Bank of China a week ago, that it wasn't taken as negatively as I would have expected. But I think, you know, we knew this story of the bifurcation between Chinese economy and the U.S. economy in particular, even at the start of this year. And that really is just more evidence to that. And, you know, it's going to be very interesting. Again, these are the world's biggest economies going very much the opposite way in terms of monetary policy and arguably in terms of the growth story as well. And so, you know, that will have some very big repercussions towards the end of the year. It's just unclear to me at the moment what those repercussions are going to be.
Vivek, at some point, I mean, do you assume, and maybe I assume wrongly, that actually PBOC, but China, you know, China policymakers will just have to do more to support the economy?
Well, I think that's what we're all watching for, right? And I guess the word you mentioned earlier, surprise, I think it did take people by surprise. So clearly, we're seeing that there is a level of activity which will cause the policymakers to step in. But I think, you know, for a long period of time, we're probably expecting a little bit more in terms of the policy than we've seen. So I think second-guessing it is difficult. I think, you know, as we're looking forward to next year, the environment that we saw at the start of last year in the West, of the idea of the restart, that's something that ultimately will play out at some point in China as well. So I think there will come a point where growth will naturally be strong from restart dynamics. It's in the interim, in the bridging period, how much policy support do we need? And I think that's a hard question to answer.
But does China have the, I guess, the capacity of taking the world down with it?
I mean, that is very much the fear, Francine, definitely, because, again, I think the initial economies that will get sideswiped, of course, are the beneficiaries of that Chinese demand, right? We're talking about your iron ore producers in Australia. We're talking about some of the economies within the Asian region that very much depend on that China supply chain type story. And so that is very much the fear, I think. But then I guess it's kind of also in danger of creating this bifurcated world where economies that are less exposed to China, particularly in emerging markets, will start doing better than those who are very much exposed to China. We could well see this kind of divide that goes beyond just the U.S. and China, but also the economies are exposed to these respective countries.
I wanted to ask you also, Vivek, about currency dynamics and what this means. I mean, the dollar's strength we've seen so far, what this means for emerging markets.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, so we're not making a sort of big sort of positive story on the emerging markets at this moment in time because of the uncertainty that we're seeing, particularly in the near term around that dollar strength. And in particular, if you believe that, as I was saying earlier, that some of the markets kind of hoping that the Fed is about to pivot rather than actually seeing it in terms of what they're saying, there could still be more strength yet to come, I think. And therefore, this isn't an environment in which we're kind of particularly leaning into emerging markets. You know, I've already mentioned the point that on a tactical horizon basis, it's DM that we're actually underweight. But longer term, actually, we think DM actually probably offers a little bit of a better bet in terms of the equity space on a beta level at least.
I'm going to put you both on the spot. Is there a favorite indicator or a favorite chart that you look at that not many other people look at to give us an indication of where the economy is headed? Vivek.
Favorite one. I think
least favorite one.
I mean, I think, to be honest, I think it's probably something everyone else looks at. I think it's the key to the story at this moment in time is what the markets are expecting that central banks will do relative to what they will actually do. And I think, therefore, looking at how market expectations change on sometimes not much news, I think that's the key thing to watch.
Well, for me, it's the lipstick index, Francine.
Of course.
What else better indicator there is? Exactly, yeah. No, I think really it's going to be very much the focus is on the consumer, how they react to how policy is playing out in the real economy. We know, of course, that there is a bit of a lag there. And so it might be some time before we start seeing the effect of that on inflation. And again, whether that starts to kind of like be reflected in consumers' wallets. But it is very much the focus, I think, for central banks and markets both.
We also have a new full English breakfast index and a mayonnaise index, but we'll get onto it a little bit later. Christina Guino and Vivek Paul, a senior portfolio strategist at BlackRock Investment Institute. Thank you both for joining us. Coming up, we're looking ahead to the Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell's speech at the Jackson Hole Symposium. Don't miss our coverage of that. That starts on Friday. This is Bloomberg.
This week, as the world watches inflation rise, employment rebound, and fiscal policies react, all roads lead to Jackson Hole for the Kansas City Fed's 2022 Economic Policy Symposium. Bloomberg's all-star team is live as policymakers and financial insiders discuss the economic issues and solutions that keep the world's money moving. Coverage starts August 25th on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
VK ฟิล์มรถยนต์กันร้อนดีราคาถูกรถยนต์เริ่มต้น 3,000 บาท
We believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. This platform will help them share their ideas to reshape our world. Bold thinking, breakthrough action. Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
In the past 2 decades, China has built large infrastructure projects in almost every country in Africa.
African governments themselves said, we are tired of aid and charity. We want to do trade, we want to be treated like partners. The Chinese came along and said, great, we don't do aid and charity, we want to do business with you.
Global Gateway will mobilize 300 billion euros till 2027.
Now the US and Europe are answering back with their own infrastructure initiatives to counter China, but African experts are skeptical.
China has been that guy around the corner with, a bouquet of flowers to Africa, the US, Europe and the UK have time and time again said, be careful of the flowers you see out of the window, they have thorns on them.
The difference between political gossip and policy intelligence. Bloomberg Government provides our clients with expert reporting, analysis, and public affairs tools that give you the edge in reaching policymakers on the Hill. When you're in the business of influence in Washington, information and connections are the currencies on which you rely. For knowledge you can act upon, the difference is Bloomberg Government.
Everything you need to get set for the start of U.S. trading. Bloomberg The Open with Jonathan Farrell. Drilling down on the numbers and preparing you as only Bloomberg can. Weekdays on Bloomberg.
French President President Emmanuel Macron there. Live pictures we understand from the Élysée Palace, his first cabinet meeting since the summer recess. I was looking at approval ratings for President of France. They were actually dropping by 1 point in the past month as he was overtaken by his Prime Minister, Elisabeth Borne. This is according to the Journal du Dimanche. Now, the monthly poll actually showed that about 37% of those surveyed were satisfied with Macron's performance, down from 38% in July. It'll be interesting to have a listen at what Macron, I don't know if it's a pep talk. I mean, what do? Do you come after some recess and do you set out the agenda, or is he saying like, guys, we've got to rally the troops, we've got to pass reforms and onwards? I wonder whether it's a pep talk. I'd quite like to get a pep talk from Emmanuel Macron, or from anyone for that matter. No matter, let's get straight to the Bloomberg First World News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
I'll give you a pep talk later, Francine. Canada is planning to start shipping green hydrogen to Germany. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Chancellor Olaf Scholz signed a 5-year agreement for the fuel to be produced by wind power in Canada's eastern provinces. The aim is to create a transatlantic supply chain for hydrogen, with the first deliveries by 2025. Now, it is reported that almost half of the European Union is under drought conditions, with the weather set to remain warmer and drier until November, as well as affecting vegetation and crops. The report notes severe impacts on the energy sector, particular hydropower and the cooling systems of other power plants. Here in the UK, Liz Truss is the favourite to be the next Prime Minister, and she's confirmed she would hold a fiscal event in the first weeks in office. Speaking at a Conservative Party meeting, Truss hinted at targeted cost of living support for pensioners. Her campaign has signalled she would not wait for the usual budget estimates before delivering action on those soaring energy bills. The result of the leadership contest will be announced on the 5th of September. And tributes are being paid to Julian Robertson, the billionaire founder of Tiger Management, who has died at the age of 90. Robertson became one of his generation's most successful hedge fund managers, but by the late 90s, his funds had $22 billion in assets and annual returns averaging 32%. But a wrong-way bet on the yen led to losses as he closed the funds in 2000. In later years, he was celebrated as a mentor to a wave of investors, and they were known as the Tiger Cubs. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
One of the brilliant minds, of course, when it comes to investing. Coming up 6 months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the global economy will never be the same. We'll get the latest on the state and the conflict. This is Bloomberg.
ไม้สังเคราะห์ SCG ล็อกสีสวยทนจากทุกสภาพแวดล้อมที่มีเทคโนโลยี Color Lock Plus.
We believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. This platform will help them share their ideas to reshape our world. Bold thinking, breakthrough action. Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
Is crucially important, and I think we've moved from this attitude from it's an indulgence, a waste of time, almost an illness that needs a cure.
For something as universally important to human life as sleep, mysteries surrounding its necessity and utility have only just been recently uncovered.
Some of our biggest discoveries were in the 1970s or 1980s, and so it makes it a really exciting field because it seems as though we're uncovering new insights each and every day.
Some scientists are going further to find out how sleep and what happens there can be harnessed to further expand our understanding.
It's easy to memorize things. That makes you smart if you can spit back a lot of facts. But if you want to be wise, if you really want wisdom, you got to know when and how and why to use that information. And that's what your brain figures out while you're sleeping.
The top names at the Fed are on Bloomberg.
I have a baseline case going into September that is 50 basis points. That's where I've been since the last meeting. But I have an open mind about whether 75 is going to be necessary. 50, 75 doesn't just depend on a data point, even an important one like the CPI. I like to say that we're data dependent, we're not data point dependent.
Nobody covers the Fed like Bloomberg, your global business authority.
Is moving both Citadel and Citadel Securities to Miami. The scoop was broken by Bloomberg's Amanda Gordon.
Taking back control, Neil Kashkari says the Fed needs tighter monetary policy to keep inflation in check. Cautious mood, stocks fluctuate as investors look ahead to Jackson Hole. And 6 months on, Ukraine marks a tense Independence Day as it hits the half-year milestone since Russia's invasion. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, let's focus in on Ukraine, and the U.S. will announce another $3 billion in arms later today. Now, this as American officials have warned Russia may step up in strikes in the coming days. Today, Ukraine celebrates its Independence Day, which also marks 6 months since Russia's invasion. Now, we heard from a number of world leaders today and yesterday, and they're pledging continued support.
We are united in supporting Ukraine, also because defending Ukraine means defending the rules-based international order that our two countries rely on.
I would like to call upon Russia to cease the military actions and to withdraw its forces from the territory of Ukraine.
Let's get the latest now from Mark Champion, our senior reporter for international affairs. So, Mark, we're 6 months in. We've had warnings that actually Russia strikes may intensify. What does that mean in terms of state of play?
Well, you know, this has been an intense war for quite some time, you know, these will be really punitive strikes, demonstrative. There's really very little movement on the ground, and the Russians, in fact, are digging in the south so that they can sort of ward off any attempted counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. In the east, the other main front, the Russians are making extremely slow progress, if any, at this point. I mean, there's been some horrific reporting, of course, about cages, you know, in certain parts of Ukraine to put the prisoners of war, the Ukrainian prisoners of war, on trial, about also children being misplaced or sent to Russia to be adopted. Are there any signs of this coming to an end, of, you know, the end being close? Unfortunately not. I mean, the Indonesians have been trying to broker some kind of talks, but very quickly said there's no interest, not from Zelensky, who today, to mark Independence Day, said, look, we're not interested. We were interested in peace at the beginning, peace talks. Now we're just interested in victory. And from the Russians, they also haven't reached even their minimal goals, so there's no interest there. The Russians have stated that. You have a great piece today. Congratulations. We'll also push out on social media, looking at, you know, the perceptions and how that's changed of the military might of Russia because of the war in Ukraine. Is this perception also within Russia? You know, that's difficult to say. There's still strong support for the war. There's stronger support now than there was at the beginning of the war. So it's difficult to say. We really don't have a good handle because there's so little free speech, free media now in Russia. It's difficult to really gauge how people feel. The one thing, you know, kind of good guide that we have is, are people signing up to mobilize? Are they signing up to join and go fight the Ukrainians in the the way that the Ukrainians are signing up to go fight the Russians? And the answer is largely no. And the Russians are really having to scramble to get mercenaries, etc. They also dug into their allies among Syrian militias, and they're going to Chechnya. They're going to a lot of different places to try and get them. They are trying to mobilize different forces in different places, but the best information that we have is that it's not a tremendous success.
Mark, thank you so much. Our senior reporter there, Mark Champion. Now let's dig into the economic fallout that we've seen over the course of the past 6 months. Joining us is our Lizzie Birding, looking at the economic impact. Lizzie, I mean, just to put it simply, if you look at the sanctions, they haven't really worked, in the way that we thought they would cripple the Russian economy.
And that is what we thought at the start, but no, it doesn't seem to be that way. Though it is true to say that the data are very unreliable out of Russia, more so even than before the war. You're seeing Chinese exports to Russia up, and even you've got oil and gas prices up, but volumes down. But because of the higher prices, it means that in sales terms, value terms, the exports are up. So that's lining Putin's coffers, actually. It's a difficult picture, even if the economy isn't crippled. But the comfort, if you can put it that way, is that sanctions are a slow poison. Russia's suffering from brain drain. You've had an estimated 300,000 people leave already. They tend to be the young, entrepreneurial, urban people. There'll be more as the war carries on and the economy weakens. And even if the war ends, Europe's going to continue to wean itself off Russian energy as fast as it can. So the West can only hope that this pain's worth it.
So in terms of European countries, because of the energy price that's gone up, I mean, who's suffering the most? Or it's kind of like the world in reverse, I guess.
Yeah, it's Germany and its eastern neighbours who are bearing the brunt of Russia cutting off the gas supplies. But then everyone in Europe scrambling for stocking up for the winter, which means that the wholesale gas prices, as we know, have gone up to dizzying heights. Even the UK, that isn't so dependent on Russia for raw energy, because of its storage model, has double-digit inflation. And so it's a headache for central banks that are having to hike interest rates into recession. And it's a nightmare for politicians. We don't know in the UK, for example, how the next Prime Minister is going to handle it. So it's creating market jitters. But above all, let's not forget, Ukraine is suffering the most. The IMF sees its GDP shrinking 35% this year. There's already talk about reconstruction. And Ukraine's going to have to rebuild its farmers, its industries, its businesses if it wants to end the war on its own terms.
Lizzie, thank you so much. Lizzie Burden there with a look at, of course, some of the sanctions. Now we're joined by Judy Dempsey, non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie Europe. Judy, talk to us a little bit about how you see this ending.
I think what Mark Champion was saying is it's very difficult to even make any kind of predictions. The longer this war goes on and the brutality that's meted out to the Ukrainian citizens, the sense is that President Zelensky of Ukraine will not actually be ready to hold any kind of negotiations at the moment, nor indeed will President Putin, despite the fact of the extraordinary destruction taking place. And what we don't know is the number of deaths on the Russian side. So essentially, talking about an end game, it's certainly not in sight at the moment.
So, Judy, what does it tell us in terms of what the next step is? I know we were speaking also to Ukrainian MP asking for more arms, but also more tanks. Is there a point where it just becomes much more difficult for a lot of the Western countries, because of the energy crisis, to support Ukraine with arms?
Well, this is the big question that actually is not yet being asked in many European Union member states. At the moment, there is this kind of solidarity with Ukraine. There's no doubt there's a sense that, well, given the energy prices, given the drought, given the extraordinary impact of the climate over this past summer, there's a sense, well, wouldn't it be good if this war could end? The real problem, which I see sitting here in Berlin, is that where's the diplomacy? We had a little bit of diplomacy when it came to trying to get grain exports from Ukraine out to the rest of the world. But where is the diplomacy? Where is the political push to try to mediate? And at the moment, it's just not there.
So, Judy, what comes next? When you look at what we also heard from Zelensky, and I know it's very, very difficult today because of Independence Day, because of all of this talk about extra violent attacks from Russia. But how does this end? Do we need to find peace and compromise, or is it really one country over the other?
Conflicts are very difficult to end because what happens with the conflict, and you look around the world, is that they create facts on the ground. And once one side creates facts on the ground, the other side, whose land or territory has been compromised, is very unwilling to accept those facts on the ground. This is a huge problem now facing the Ukrainians. At what stage could they even be invited or encouraged to go to the table? But as Zelensky says, and he cannot say anything more to his people, we will go to the table when we get our land back. And at the moment, this is his mantra, this is his wish, this is the support from the Ukrainians. And as for the Russian side, it's actually very difficult to know for how long President Putin can sustain this kind of aggression with so few gains.
Judy, is there a mediator in this? We know that it's unclear what China and India are doing, right? Or that they haven't really condemned Russia, that they're buying some of their energy sources. Will we see a turnaround in that?
We're not going to see a turnaround with India. India is being very, very careful with its relations with Russia, with its relations with China, with its relations with the United States. We can actually rule out India playing a role, and it's not its forte. China, we've been waiting for China to play some role, but its interests are kind of bilateral with Russia, what it can extract from Russia in this conflict, which is very unsettling for China because it sees how the West, as we know it, is actually quite united. United States is not in a position to play a role, and of course the European Union, because of the sanctions and its suspicion and how Putin wouldn't entertain the EU playing a role. We don't see any mediators yet. We did see the mediators of the United Nations and Turkey playing a role over the grain issue, but it'd be interesting to see what kind of agenda the United Nations has on its plate at the moment, but so far we don't see anything in sight. And the longer this goes on, the more tragedy, the more deaths, and don't forget the huge impact of migration. There's 5 million Ukrainians outside Ukraine, and let's not forget the internally displaced.
Judy, where do you see the biggest fault line? We know and understand there's like horrific stories coming out of Ukraine, and then there's really stories of hope. Like, what do you read to try and have a real understanding also of the support this war is getting inside Russia?
These are immensely complicated questions because if we knew, then we would see some kind of end in sight. There's one aspect of Russia, and Mark Champion brought this up, that for the moment the support for the war is there, but you must remember there are so many young Russians outside Russia who are engaged in civil society, who are trying to help the Ukrainians, who are creating a kind of new young Russia outside Russia. And it's a huge economic brain drain for Russia itself. For the moment, this doesn't affect President Putin. But in the longer term, this is extraordinarily damaging for Russia, not to speak of the huge reconstruction costs for Ukraine. This is not a win-win for Russia by any stretch of the imagination. For the long term, it's pretty miserable.
Judy, thank you so much. Judy Dempsey, their non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, joining us this morning. Coming up, the Jackson Hole drum roll. More on our conversation with the Goldman Sachs chief economist Jan Hatzius on the Jackson Hole. We'll get his views on what to expect from Jay Powell later this week. This is coming up on Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg.
At Bloomberg, we believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. It's a community of global leaders and innovators who are blazing new trails to transform business and government. This platform will help them share their ideas with the world and provide access to the resources they need to bring them to life. Bold thinking, breakthrough action. Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
The markets are preparing to close, but the day is not over yet.
Stock that is now up about 45%.
A lot of volatility right now.
You need the power of the Bloomberg terminal to get you market-moving data before anyone else.
These numbers are much higher than expected.
Upgraded today to overweight.
You need top analysts to bring you exclusive global insight into cross-asset markets.
The muni bond market.
China is a really big focus.
Bitcoin ain't playing along today.
It's going to be short-term.
Bloomberg Markets, The Close, weekdays on Bloomberg.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, traders bracing for hawkish talk from Fed officials at Jackson Hole later this week. Goldman Sachs chief economist Jan Hatzius told us he thinks Jay Powell will signal a slower pace of rate increases.
I think the U.S. doesn't have quite the same degree of headwinds as both China and Europe. In China, obviously, you have the zero COVID policy and the property market downturn, which is a multi-year development. In Europe, you've got the gas issue. There's nothing quite to the same degree that we have in the US, but it's going to be a slow growth environment, below trend. The Fed wants below trend. That's why financial conditions are where they are, because the Fed's tightening pretty aggressively. And you've got the fiscal drag. So plenty of headwinds for sure, but I don't think it's quite as bad as in China or the euro area.
How do you expect Chairman Powell to navigate that, Jan, this Friday?
I think he'll be balancing between two things. One, I think he will lay out a case, as he did at the last press conference, as they did in the minutes, for slowing the pace of increases. We had 275 basis point moves. Our expectation would be, barring significant data surprises, that the September move is 50. I think I don't think he'll be specific about the number, but I do think he'll be saying, there is a risk of over-tightening, and therefore it makes sense to go a little bit more slowly than these really outsized increases. But at the same time, he'll make clear that the job is not yet done. Inflation is way too high. They're very committed to bringing inflation back down to 2% or thereabouts. So I think it will be a balancing act.
Yeah, and there's a mix here of themes, and one of them is what we just saw from Macy's, where Bloomingdale's and the haves do well, and Macy's and the have-nots really are struggling. Or it can be John Taylor of Stanford visiting with Bloomberg in the last 24 hours saying sustain a higher yield environment. Are we getting our x-axis wrong right now? Do we need to look out 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years of elevated inflation?
I think a year from now, 2 years from now, inflation will be much lower because there are some drivers. I mean, commodity prices are clear. The goods sector in general, I do think that's going to come off a lot. The risk is more on the services side, where we've seen less of an indication that things are slowing, especially rents are still growing very quickly. So I think that's still going to be well above normal, into 2023 and maybe even beyond. So I do think that there are going to be improvements, but not everywhere.
Well, that was Jan Hatzius, chief economist at Goldman Sachs, speaking with Bloomberg's Tom Keene and Jonathan Farrow. Now let's get to your Bloomberg business flash. Here's Leanne Garrett. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Nordstrom has seen its shares sink in late trading after the U.S. retail trimmed its full-year outlook. The department store operator says it will move to aggressively clear out inventory, a profit-eroding measure that has also been necessary at other retailers as the industry wobbles following the pandemic shopping binge. Investors saw Nordstrom as insulated by its affluent customer base. Now, battery-making giant CATL has reported an 82% jump in first-half profit. The Chinese company saw profit of $1.2 billion, beating estimates as it bounced back from a disastrous start to the year that saw its sharpest ever drop in quarterly earnings. CATL shares have gained almost 50% since hitting a low in May as it ramps up global capacity. Ping An, China's largest insurer by market value, posted an unexpected rise in first-half profit. Net income climbed 3.9% from a year earlier to $8.8 billion, beating estimates of $7.7 billion. Impairment losses fell 17% from a year earlier. Despite pandemic-induced lockdowns, Ping An says its life business did very well. And Vietnam's vast coffee bean stockpiles are shrinking, a phenomenon that's set to push rising prices even higher. According to traders surveyed by Bloomberg, stockpiles will halve by the end of September from levels seen a year earlier. Output from Vietnam, the world's largest supplier of Robusta beans, is expected to drop this year. Robusta is a cheaper variety than Arabica, and it has seen strong demand as people look to mitigate those soaring coffee prices. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. So we're all drinking cheaper coffee, Francine.
We are. I mean, one of the funniest things I've read is actually Javier Blas, who said, from September, everyone's going to be back in the office. This is what we're going to do because of energy prices. And now because of coffee prices, we will get employees back full time.
So more incentive to come back to the office as the coffee machine.
There you go. 100% for everyone. I know. Let's also check on the markets, Leanne, to see exactly where we're at. All about Jackson Hole. And of course, that press conference from Jay Powell on Friday. For the moment, we're seeing a bit of a reversal. Nothing huge. The U.S. 10-year yield holding above 3%. Euro dollar 99.42 at below parity. And then European stocks pretty much unchanged, but with a little bit of green. Now, coming up, a whistleblower accuses Twitter of covering up security flaws and fake accounts. Could this help Elon Musk in his legal battle with the social media giant? Well, we'll talk about that next, and this is Bloomberg.
VK ฟิล์มรถยนต์กันร้อนดีราคาถูกรถยนต์เริ่มต้น 3,000 บาท
You will put a woman on Mars. You will be the first chief crypto officer. Because when you subscribe to Bloomberg, you won't just get news. You will get insight into limitless possibilities. Before you change the world, Bloomberg.
I've always been a person who's just been attracted to hair. I like to sit and think and theorize how I can manifest these visions that I have for braiding and how I can take something that may seem like it's a line drawing in my mind and apply that to someone's scalp.
We are the only culture that has hair that grows out of our head the way that it does. Anyone from the African diaspora is born with this amazingly curly hair that can be shaped into a variety of different ways of expression.
I want Black people to love themselves for how they naturally appear, and also to appreciate the cultural practices such as braiding that our ancestors have practiced for centuries.
However you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Elon Musk has received a potential boost in his legal battle with Twitter. A whistleblower has accused the social media company of egregious deficiencies in its handling of spam bots and user information. Well, joining us now is Alex Webb from Bloomberg Quick Take. Alex, we had a great roundup yesterday of Jack Dorsey being subpoenaed, and now there's like whistleblower accusations. How does that impact the legal battle?
So it doesn't seem to help his accusation to do with bots, the idea that Twitter has intentionally or knowingly misstated the number of bots on the platform. The way that it might help is that there's a suggestion that maybe Twitter isn't as secure as it purports to be. And if that's the case, then perhaps Elon has the opportunity to pivot and say, well, let's forget about this bots thing. This safety thing is a material adverse effect. That's the key term here. Is there something which gives him an opportunity to back out the deal? So that would be the kind of possible weakness it creates.
So at the same time, Elon Musk also has to hand over information.
Yes, and like that's going to be fascinating as well to see some of that personal correspondence, although sometimes you kind of...
This is SMS? No, or DMs?
We don't know. Presumably, all of that, anything is possible, although sometimes it seems as though Elon just expresses himself on social media, so who knows whether he would have said anything different in private. Personally, I find the discovery amidst all of this fascinating. You know, what's in Jack Dorsey's correspondence, what's in Elon Musk's correspondence, because what sort of the super wealthy say behind the scenes can often shed a huge amount of interesting light.
So will this be public information, or is this just for the courts, I think, in like a smaller state in the US?
Well, it depends what the
information says,
what the Twitter legal team decides to release and what Elon's legal team also decides to release, I think, that and what gets then submitted to the court, you know, for their consumption. So it's not an automatic assumption that everything will become public, but elements of it may well do.
So there's also a Tesla stock split, which used to be, you know, very enticing, but now because of the Twitter conundrum, like it kind of taking a back step, but it's a big deal.
Well, yeah, there's certainly the hope when you do these sort of stock splits, it's really about addressing retail investors at the moment, and we've seen stock splits from Amazon, did a 20, Google 20-to-1 stock splits. These are sizable ones. Tesla won't be quite on that scale. It's going to be a 3-to-1 stock split. But the idea is that, you know, people who with the stock at $650, something like that at the moment, go, well, that's a little bit pricey. I could maybe afford $200 and buy one or two shares. And so it creates an opportunity for some investors to get involved who might not otherwise do so. And given the appetite over the past few years, that might have an effect. Equally, are the sort of people who are retail investors going to have that capital given the inflationary context? It may not be quite as easy.
Alex, I read this crazy story, and I've read some pretty crazy stories today on the Bloomberg terminal, but this is amazing. Like there's such Tesla mania, I think, in Korea, that people are actually selling their flats, renting, to make sure that they take advantage of this.
I haven't seen that story.
Okay, it's a great story.
I will check it out. It sounds wonderful. I'll check it out.
And it's basically saying like people are indebting themselves by like $200,000 just to make sure that they get a piece of the action. Alex, as always, thank you so much for making us smarter on that. Alex Webb there from Bloomberg Quick Take. Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour. Matt Miller and Kate Lyons in New York. Our Anna Edwards is here in London, and this is Bloomberg.
SCG ล็อกสีสวยทนจากทุกสภาพแวดล้อมที่มีเทคโนโลยี Color Lock Plus.
We believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. This platform will help them share their ideas to reshape our world. Bold thinking, breakthrough action. Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
Apple's delaying its next major iPad software update, iPadOS 16, by about a month from September to October. Apple made the decision for a number of reasons, including a still buggy Stage Manager multitasking interface and in order to link the launch closer to the more similar macOS Ventura. Still, it's an unusual move. Since shifting the launches to the fall in 2011, Apple has released its new iPhone and iPad software updates simultaneously each year around September. By staggering the releases, users may find some issues around compatibility with cross-device features like retracting and editing messages in iMessage, the new shared iCloud photo library, and the new feature for transferring FaceTime calls between iPhones and iPads. It will also make it a bit harder for developers to launch apps that run on both the iPad and iPhone that require new APIs and features found across iPadOS 16 and iOS 16. Regardless, it was still, of course, the right move. Stage Manager on iPadOS 16 is still quite buggy, I don't find it particularly intuitive, and it's not compatible with most iPads and many third-party apps on the App Store. The feature clearly needs some more polish. And complaints from consumers about Stage Manager will now no longer probably overshadow the earlier launch of the iPhone 14.
No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
There's a sense it'll get to 7% in the coming months. Do you see that coming true?
There was something of a grey zone battle between Taiwan and China.
Where are the job cuts to come from? We will not just cut and run.
With unmatched reach and resources from more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, your global business authority.
Strong enough to stay, we will never.
We're looking at a rocky landing.
You can't kind of overestimate the vulnerability of the economy in corporate America.
There is a broader global story that the market is panicking about what Fed Chair Powell will say at Jackson Hole.
Where I would disagree more with market pricing is the pricing for significant rate cuts.
I think the notion that markets have to move a material amount based on comments on Friday, we think is misplaced.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kaylee Lines.
It's 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong. Our top stories today. Investors wait for more clues from the Fed. The Minneapolis Fed chief says it's very clear more tightening is needed. Stocks and U.S. futures stall. 6 months of Putin's war. The invasion has damaged Russia's superpower image. The U.S. will mark the anniversary by giving Ukraine billions more of weapons. And the whistleblower who may rescue Elon Musk. Experts say his revelations could help Musk to walk away from that $44 billion deal to buy Twitter. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards in London, Kriti Gupta and Kaylee Lines alongside in New York. Matt Miller is off today. And Kaylee, sentiment pretty weak through the Asia session, pretty flat through the European session so far.
Yeah, we've been struggling for direction a bit when it comes to the Western markets over the last 48 hours or so, Anna, but it seems that the trajectory broadly is lower as we beat the drum to Jackson Hole on Friday. That definitely was the case in the Asian session overnight. Stocks down across the board. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index falling for a 5th day in a row, down by about 0.5%. And China, a real underperformer in Asia, with the CSI 300 off by nearly 2 full percentage points. Of course, in addition to just the broader overhang of the threat of tighter Fed policy and growth concerns, China also has a real problem in the property sector, and that is exemplified overnight by Logan Group. 51% decline for that stock after it resumed trading reported revenue that missed estimates. And of course, this comes as it's weighing restructuring to deal with its massive debt load. So really just underscores the turmoil in the Chinese property sector. And of course, that has been dragging on the Chinese currency as well. The Chinese yuan weaker against the dollar once again today, right around 687.50 at the moment. Kriti, that is the weakest yuan yuan. Going back 2 years to August of 2020, it is raising the depreciation question and what exactly policymakers are going to do about it.
And that's a crucial question as we talk about, of course, the ripple effects of the dollar story. Dollar stronger today, as you pointed out, Kaylee, against Chinese currencies. But if you take a look at the ripple effects in U.S. assets, well, there perhaps aren't that many. Take a look at the Bloomberg Dollar Index. It's about flat on the session, still hovering around those July highs, though. So that is significant as we talk about simply just how strong the dollar is. Remember, it's the margin of the move that matters, but really no clear conviction, like you said, in today's trading session, even going into Friday, or I should say Thursday and Friday, the Jackson Hole meeting seems to be a wait-and-see approach. The S&P futures up about only 0.1%. 10-year yield not really doing much, only down 1 basis point. Even Bitcoin down only 0.5%. I think what's notable here, though, is that Bitcoin and futures are diverging a little bit, Anna. What does that message, does that really send? We really don't know this early in the trading day.
Yeah, and here in Europe, Chrissy, to your point, a picture of a lack of conviction, a picture of a summer lull, perhaps. A lot of grey on this map of Europe right now, suggesting that we are not exactly sure which way we're heading next. But European equity markets then broadly fairly flat. The London market, actually contrary to the futures picture we'd had overnight, underperforms a little bit, and part of that is to do with basic resource stocks. That is an area of weakness here for European equities. We're seeing a little bit of weakness in the London-listed mining sector, but also elsewhere. And you see that sector down by 1.2% right now. Brent crude actually just slowly getting back to levels that we've known recently. 101.58, so having dipped down into the 90s, of course. 101.58 is where we trade, up by 1.4%. This is the Richemont share price, the luxury goods company, up by 2.9%. They're selling their stake in Yoox Net-a-Porter, and as a result, the market seems to like this. Even though they're going to take a charge on this activity, it does seem as if analysts are responding pretty favourably, saying this is something that's been talked about for a long time, and they're pleased to see it happen. There have been some investor pressure piling up ahead of an AGM to come. And SimCorp, this is a company that makes software, Kaylee, for the investment management industry. They've had a number of approaches, apparently, to see if they could take that business private. So that stock is down by 4% this morning.
All right, one to watch throughout the trading day for sure, Anna. And let's take a look at what else we are watching throughout the trading day and beyond. The White House is planning to make its long-awaited announcement on student debt relief. We'll have more on that story in just a moment. Plus, we'll get more tech earnings. NVIDIA, the chip maker, as well as Salesforce will both be reporting. And some U.S. economic data is expected, including durable goods orders and pending home sales. Of course, Greedy, we have seen a real softness in the housing data as of late.
And certainly something we're going to keep an eye on as we start to hear just from a lot of the Fed regional governors. Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari says the U.S. inflation is very high and the central bank must act to bring it back under control. He spoke at a gathering of the Wharton Club of Minnesota yesterday.
With inflation this high, I'm in the mode of we need to err on making sure we're getting inflation down and only relax when we see compelling evidence that inflation is well on its way back down to 2%.
Joining us now as investors wait for more Fed clues is Ksenia Galuchko, Bloomberg Equities editor. A picture of a summer lull, it seems, for European equities, at least today, Ksenia. Lacking a little bit of direction, but there are certainly things to look ahead to, Jackson Hole for one. And all the focus is what the Fed is going to say about its path from here, the extent to which it is still laser focused on inflation.
Absolutely, yes. So we've had a tremendous summer rally in both European and U.S. stocks, and that rally was mainly driven by expectations that the Fed will pivot and become more dovish considering the recession risks and some of the poor economic data. Well, now those expectations are being dimmed, and now the market is thinking that actually Powell's speech on Friday will be quite hawkish, and after Kashkari's statements, we are expecting now in the market that the Fed will continue with its hawkish stance.
All right. Well, we will have to continue to watch how these markets behave into Powell's speech on Friday. Bloomberg's Ksenia Galuchko, thank you so much. And of course, beginning tomorrow, surveillance will be in Wyoming for the Fed's annual symposium in Jackson Hole. Our special coverage will kick off at 6 a.m. New York time, 11 a.m. in London. Tom, John, and Lisa will see you there. Now, turning to politics, important Democratic primary results coming out yesterday. In New York, U.S. Representative Jerry Nadler beat fellow incumbent Representative Carolyn Maloney. Meanwhile, in Florida, U.S. Representative Charlie Crist will be the Democratic candidate to challenge incumbent Governor Ron DeSantis in a race that could have implications for the 2024 presidential election. Anne-Marie Horder, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, joins us now with more from D.C. So, Anne-Marie, which of these results are the most consequential?
Well, Florida and New York, incredibly consequential, also very late in the primary game. I would say for Florida, it's really about the governor race, even though we also know who's going to be challenging the incumbent for Senator Marco Rubio, as well as going to be Val Demings. For the governor race, it's incredibly important, obviously, because all eyes are on whether or not DeSantis will make this 2024 bid. And this is exactly what Representative Chris said yesterday. He's going for his old job. He was governor once before. He was also Republican once before. And he was saying that this is how they could stop Governor DeSantis, the incumbent, to make that race for 2024. The big issue they have is the fundraising dollars. Christ is going to be incredibly behind when it comes to those dollar figures, and really when it comes to the fact that the underdog in this race. And then when you look at New York, this was incredibly difficult for both these individuals, Representative Nadler and Maloney, because they have been in the job for years. They are seasoned lawmakers. They're on very important committees in the House, and they've worked well together in the past. And this got quite heated leading up to it because of redistricting. They were actually facing off against each other. So you have Nadler of the Upper West Side winning over Maloney. This was a big blow to her and her supporters.
And Anne-Marie, of course, we are also due to hear some comments from President Biden as well on a student loan plan. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the White House has been keeping this very close to their chest, these cards, and they've been weighing whether or not what to do with this student loan forgiveness. And it does look like they are expected to forgive a debt of $10,000. There would be a cap for those making $125,000 to $150,000. Also, an extension of the pause on repaying debt till December 2022. It's a tricky line for the president and the administration to walk right now, because on one hand, you have many progressive advocates who are saying this does not go far enough. At the same time, what has been the biggest issue facing this administration is inflation, and many are calling the fact that this could potentially be inflationary. But today we are likely going to hear this. For months we've been waiting to hear whether or not or how much the president was going to move on student debt forgiveness.
Yeah, cutting it very close to that August 31st deadline. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horder reporting from Washington. Thank you so much, as always. Meanwhile, on the foreign policy front, the U.S. will announce another $3 billion in arms for Ukraine later today. This comes as the country marks a tense Independence Day and 6 months since Russia's invasion. Germany, meanwhile, is also said to be finalizing a shipment of additional weapons and ammunition for Ukraine. Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke yesterday.
We will continue our international outreach and underline the global dimension of this conflict. We condemn Russia's attempts to forcefully integrate parts of Ukrainian territory. Our message is clear. Any sham referenda or other attempts to alter the status of parts of Ukraine territory will never be recognized, and that such steps preclude any negotiation approaches.
Mark Champion, Bloomberg senior reporter for international affairs, joins us now with more. Mark, we're 6 months in, and we have warnings that Russia's strikes may only intensify. Are there any signs of an end to this war?
Well, in short, no. You had a fast-moving campaign at the beginning. It's become very slow in the east, where the Russians really refocused most of their efforts. They're making virtually no progress now. In the south, they've sent troops to reinforce there and are digging in to make sure that the Ukrainians can't mount a major counteroffensive. So right now, it's a really something close to a stalemate. It's not exactly that, because each side is trying to push forward where it can, but we're more or less at a standstill, and there's no sign either of a ceasefire talks or of some sort of breakthrough on the battlefield.
Mark, 6 months into this, a good time to reflect. We came in with high expectations, I suppose, for Russia's military in the sense of what it could achieve against its strategic objectives, and pretty low expectations about Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Both of those seem to be, based on what we've seen in the past 6 months, quite wrong. So what have we learned then about Russia's military might?
Yes, I mean, there were a few people at the beginning who gave Ukraine much chance, and that they were, we in general have been wrong in expectations. That's partly because of what the Ukrainians have done. They've been incredibly innovative and incredibly brave.
And support they've had.
They've had a lot of support, building up over time, but nevertheless, but it's also been about the failures, and maybe even primarily about the failures of the Russian military machine. Partly this was, issues of command and political decision, but, we've also seen some really fundamental failure, an inability, what military analysts have really focused on is an inability to do any kind of combined force operations, which is what you really need in order to, create dominance and move forward.
Bloomberg's Mark Champion, we thank you as always. And of course, we'll have more on the war in Ukraine later this hour with Livia Paggi, managing director at JS Held, a global consulting firm. That conversation later this hour. Meanwhile, stateside, Elon Musk has received a potential boost in his legal battle with Twitter. A whistleblower has accused the social media company of, quote, egregious deficiencies in its handling of spam bots and user information. Joining us now is Alex Webb of Bloomberg Quick Take. Alex, how do these whistleblower accusations impact Elon Musk's legal battle when it comes to Twitter?
Well, there are two parts to this. Peter Zatko, who's the former executive, he highlighted some things about the approach to spam bots, and that is clearly so far what Elon Musk has been focusing on. It seems the comments he makes don't necessarily support Musk's case when he comes to tackling Twitter. The second part, though, is about the way that Twitter handles user data. And it provides perhaps the opportunity for Elon Musk to pivot and say, well, actually, I'm not going to focus on this bots issue. I'm going to focus on the way that it handles user data, if there are significant failings, and more importantly, if the company has misstated the way that it handles such things, that could create what is known as a material adverse effect. And this is the word at the center of all of this, is the phrase at the center of all of this. Is there something that Twitter has misstated in its public filings, whether intentionally or not, and gives him the opportunity to pull out? So that is the opportunity here to pivot from bots to the security piece.
The saga and its twists and turns. Alex Webb of Bloomberg Quick Take, thank you for your continued reporting on it. Both Twitter and Tesla, I would mention, are positive in pre-market trading today. As for some of the other stocks on the move in pre-market trading here in the U.S., I want to talk about Nordstrom, the retailer that reported results after the bell yesterday. The stock is down more than 13% on the back of that after a cut to the outlook. It is a very similar story than with other retailers in that they have inventory they need to work down. That means discounting and pressure on margins. So if this move holds, it could be the worst day for the stock in about 9 months. It's a much more positive story, though, for Intuit, the financial software company, which makes things like TurboTax, which many people use to do their taxes every year. Its revenue reported and forecast beating expectations. Analysts and investors seeming pretty positive on that, with the stock up nearly 6% before the bell. And finally, I have to do it again. I feel like I've talked about Bed Bath & Beyond every single day for weeks now, but there actually is more news out today that coming from the Wall Street Journal, a report that it has secured a deal with a lender for financing as it tries to boost its liquidity and work down some of its debt. So as a result, that stock is up about 16% before the bell. So there you go, Anna. Maybe I won't have to talk about it tomorrow.
Well, maybe you will. Dangerous for us to say that we won't, I suppose, given recent trends. Kaylee, I would suggest. Let's have a look at what's coming up on the programme. We're going to be talking to Christopher Sims, Nobel laureate and Princeton University economics professor. Where are we in the inflation conversation? Has it peaked? How long does it stay at elevated levels? We'll get into all those conversations with Professor Sims shortly. And some 20 million households across the United States have fallen behind on their utility bills. Underpinning those numbers is a blistering surge in electricity prices, which in turn is propelled by soaring costs that's now anticipated in the United States in the Big Take story on Bloomberg.com, or you can go to NI Big Take. That's the function to use on your Bloomberg terminal. This is Bloomberg.
VK ฟิล์มรถยนต์เกรดสูงกันน็อตสูงสุด 76%.
At Bloomberg, we believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalysts, innovators who are blazing new trails to transform business and government. This platform will help them share their ideas with the world and provide access to the resources they need to bring them to life. Bold thinking, breakthrough action, Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
Material samples brought back from objects in space can shed light on billions of years of our solar system's history, including details about the origin of life here on Earth.
A piece of an asteroid is a piece of the earliest beginnings of a solar system.
But picking up rocks from the surface of an asteroid or planetary satellite isn't as easy as it sounds. It requires voyages of millions of miles to bodies that have never been seen up close. Probes need to land on surfaces with weak gravitational pulls, where the surface terrain is completely unknown, gather samples, and then make the long trip back. And while behemoths like NASA and SpaceX grab headlines, it's a relatively young space agency. The Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, better known as JAXA, that is taking the giant leap necessary to bring the mysteries of space back down to Earth.
As you look at the company you've created, how do you think you're having an impact on the world for the betterment of the world?
We are by far and away the best positioned entity to solve the question as to what does the human genome mean and how can you apply it to individuals.
This week, as the world watches inflation rise, employment rebound, and fiscal policies react, all roads lead to Jackson Hole for the Kansas City Fed's 2022 Economic Policy Symposium. Bloomberg's all-star team is live as policymakers and financial insiders discuss the economic issues and solutions that keep the world's money moving. Coverage starts August 25th on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
It's not the actual figure of that would be a bit higher that is the big concern. The big concern is what expectations do workers, do markets, assets have about inflation, because that would determine.
That was Nobel laureate Christopher Pissarides of the London School of Economics speaking to us earlier at the Lindau Nobel laureate meetings in Germany. Joining us now from those same meetings, another Nobel laureate, I'm pleased to say, Christopher Sims. Professor Sims, Princeton University economics professor. He won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2011. Professor, very nice to have you with us. Let's start with the question of the day, question of the year, I suppose, which is around inflation and whether you think it's peaked. I mean, let's talk about the United States. Do you see signs?
I think inflation will persist for quite a while, maybe into next year. It may have peaked. I don't think it's going to suddenly drop within the next several months. But I think the most likely scenario is that it fairly slowly recedes.
Fairly slowly recedes, but then does it linger at an elevated level? Professor, what does the trajectory for inflation look like to you? Are we talking about something, you talked about months, but are we talking months or are we talking years with inflation above Fed targets?
I think that it's going to be at least months, at least into next year, that it'll be above target levels. Whether it stays above target levels longer than that is hard to predict. It depends on exactly how policy evolves as we go forward. And of course, as we've learned, there can always be a new unanticipated shock that pushes it up or down. Of course, the way the Ukrainian war goes could have a huge impact, and that's very difficult to predict.
Professor, we got some news yesterday that there are 2 regional Fed governors who opted for a 100 basis point hike in the discount rate, not the Fed funds rate. I'm curious, as we go into the Jackson Hole meeting on Thursday and Friday as well, and a lot of the market expecting some sort of extreme hawkish move from Jerome Powell himself. I'm curious your take about what that discount rate kind of divergence really means for the broader Fed funds rate path.
I think the details of the timing don't matter that much, so long as everybody understands that the Fed is focused on getting real interest rates, that is the nominal interest rate they set minus the current inflation rate. They're intent on getting that into positive territory. That is, so even if they don't do it at their next meeting, they will keep on raising rates until they get positive real rates. So long as everybody understands that, the exact timing of that sequence is not likely to be terribly important.
What does that mean for the liquidity picture then? We, of course, are seeing a historic move when it comes to quantitative tightening. Meanwhile, the market's really struggling with that thin liquidity. Is it something you're worried about?
Well, it's something that's a normal pattern as monetary policy tightens. Liquidity, rates on interbank loans, these things begin to show signs of stress when monetary policy tightens. It's part of how monetary policy works. So it is concerning, but it's not unexpected.
Professor Sims, as we talk about tightening policy, there is a question of what the result of that will be, not just if it means inflation is down, but growth as well. Where do you put the odds of a global recession?
That's a hard question. I don't think it's certain by any means. Some people would say that with the yield curve inverting, that a recession is almost inevitable. I don't think it is inevitable, but it certainly could happen. It could also happen if fiscal policy worldwide is on average much too expansionary. We could have no recession because we failed to succeed in bringing inflation down. I don't think that's very likely, but it's something people should keep in mind as another possibility.
Well, and of course, the trajectory of global growth is not just dependent in large part on the U.S. economy, the world's largest, but also the second largest, China, which has a multitude of problems of its own. And there's tensions between those two economies, this idea of perhaps further decoupling. I'm wondering what you see as the future of globalization, if we will indeed be a more deglobalized world, and ultimately what the economic implications of that are.
Well, we have already become less globalized in that the U.S. has moved into a regime where tariffs are being used as a policy instrument, and tariffs are, even though this was started with Trump, Biden has done little to move back from it, and once tariffs go up, it tends to be politically difficult to get them back down again. So I think we're in a less globalized world already. Whether it becomes much more deglobalized, I think it's hard to say at this point. You're right, the problems China has with its economy could lead to further deterioration in the links between our economy and theirs. And this is an important issue, but its outcome is very uncertain at this point.
As is so much. Thank you so much for your time today. Christopher Sims of Princeton, a Nobel laureate in economics. We sincerely appreciate your insight. Now, coming up, as we talk about the global economy and central banks, what are the implications for foreign exchange as we have a persistently stronger dollar and a weaker pretty much everything else? We'll discuss with Esther Reichelt, Commerce Bank FX strategist, coming up. From New York and London, this is Bloomberg.
VK ฟิล์มที่ช่างติดรถยนต์แนะนำติดง่ายกันร้อนดีราคาถูก
We believe in the power of ideas. That's why we launched Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. This platform will help them share their ideas to reshape our world. Bold thinking, breakthrough action, Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst.
Nurturing also can come from men, and it's one of the qualities, I guess, that you found in your mentors that also pushed you up. Do we need even more nurturing post-pandemic? Is the way that we talk with employees going to change?
I think talent becomes the single biggest differentiator of a successful entity versus an unsuccessful entity. So you've got to do everything possible to hire, train, retain, put your arms around talent. I mean, you really got to focus on your talent. In the past, it's always been give them money, show them that they have an upward mobility and can make even more money, and that's the only reason people come to work. I think post-pandemic, we're seeing more and more people say, I have to worry about me as a person. I have to worry about my family. I want to worry about my well-being, my mental health. So we've got to start encompassing people as holistic humans as opposed to a tool of the trade, which means that we have to engage with their head, heart, and hands, not just head and hands. The heart has to be engaged. So we have to show more empathy, show that we care, that they're citizens of the community, they're members of a family, and all of those have to come into consideration as we help an executive or an employee be an employee and be a person of the community and the family. The stakes are higher.
From the world of politics to the world of business. Balance of Power with David Weston.